happening with Optus and Medibank and a lot of large organizations being in the press for a whole range of breaches. But really what we're seeing right now, which is quite pertinent, is we're seeing a lot of ransomware, and it ebbs and flows. So the first 6 months of the year, well, let's look at the year of 2022 in a snapshot. Prior to February and the war breaking out in the Ukraine, the target was very much SME businesses. Then when the war broke out between Russia and the Ukraine, we saw a dip off between March and April of incidences, because a lot of the threat actors are based in that region of the world. And there was a lot of focus and attention turned onto the war efforts. Going from April to about August, we saw again a big focus on service providers, people in professional services, lawyers, accountants, very sophisticated attacks on small businesses. And the last few months have really just seen a spotlight on large companies, which again is good for the SME side of the world, not so good for large businesses. But as we can see, we're seeing the bulk of it relating to ransomware. We're seeing 31% to BC, and then other incidences are about 13%. Globally, what have we seen, and in the region as well? We've seen that ransomware attacks increased 24% in Q1 or Q2 from Q21 of 2022. So that means quarter on quarter it's gone up. I think probably if we took the snapshot of the last 2 months, it would have come down. Again, bigger companies, less attacks, but otherwise it's more attacks, less smaller companies. A massive issue for companies is data exfiltration. It's just a fancy way of saying somebody's taken your data. But in 86% of incidences, we are seeing data leave your organizations. It means that it's so prolific that in almost every single ransomware event, we can almost assume that your client data, employee data, personal information that's vital, the lifeblood of your organization, is actually leaving your organization. And it's generally large quantities. The threat actor tools have become so sophisticated that they can take the data and large quantities of that data very quickly and very easily. What are they costing us? Well, we've seen 250,000, and that's Australian dollars on average per attack. That's not necessarily looking at the price of the ransom payment. The average ransom payment there, they're pegging at around $500,000. Again, we see some less, we see some more, depends on the size of the organization. But the biggest cost is actually the loss of data, restoring your systems, those sorts of things that we're seeing. And while the stats are telling us that we see an average ransom payment increase, we actually saw the median ransom payments decrease in Q1. There was a lot of bargaining happening. The threat actors, particularly the major players based in Russia and Eastern Europe and the Ukraine, were suddenly willing to take all sorts of discounts, particularly into April, May, and June, because there was a lot of backwards and forwards as to whether or not they were associated with Russia, with the war. There were splinter organizations that broke off from some of the main organizations. And so we saw a lot of discounting in ransom payment. Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. But certainly they were willing to work at a bargain. So Optus, Medibank, Woolworths, Energy Australia, the list keeps getting longer in the last 2 months in terms of attacks. But what are the risks? So we tend to look at this at the moment. We look at these large organizations that are in the press. And yes, they're fundamental cyber attacks. Optus affected 40% of the Australian population, for example. But that's not really where the risk lies. The risk for your organization, the risks that I see on my desk on a daily basis, are companies like yours, accounting practices, SME businesses. And the losses are much more catastrophic than for the large entities for a myriad of factors that we'll talk to in a moment. But what we're seeing currently is because of the large public scrutiny on breaches, there's an increased reputational risk. So when we used to have breaches in the last 3 years and issue breach notifications to our affected persons and individuals, we used to see maybe a 1% inquiry rate that would come back after the breach. We're now seeing a 5% query rate. So we're seeing a lot more heightened sensitivity amongst your clients, your customers, your staff in the event of a breach. And nothing's changed. The landscape's the same, but there's a lot of reputational risk. There's critique of you took too long to let me know. You've let me know too quickly and you don't know what information's been impacted. There's no right medium in terms of time. We then face a massive regulatory risk for businesses. So for example, in Australia, there's under the Federal Privacy Act, we see a $3 million threshold, which means small companies whose annual turnover is less than $3 million generally fall outside the ambit and scope of the Privacy Act. The problem now is that because of all these breaches and because of what's been tabled in terms of changes in legislation, that's going to be changing. So what we'll see is that threshold falling away entirely. In any event, that threshold is not that relevant for accounting practices in Australia because what's caught under the Act is anybody who's seen as a tax file recipient. If you deal with tax file numbers, tax information, which most accounting businesses deal with anyways, that is where you fall under the Act in any event. But smaller businesses tend to think, well, this is an Optus problem, this is a Medibank problem, this doesn't happen to small companies. My turnover is less than $3 million. I don't have to worry about the regulatory risk, the laws. That's going to change coming into 2023. And the next thing that's going to change is third-party liability claims. As the Privacy Act shifts and changes, there's a lot being said about changes to the penalties that can be levied. It's not so much the penalties that concern smaller businesses, but the fact that suddenly what will change under the law is that third parties, your clients, your customers, people affected by the breach, could then institute class actions, lawsuits, claims against your organization. And while that's devastating for any size business, for small businesses, it can be absolutely crippling. So let's turn to the trends looking at BC's business email compromises and looking at ransomware. So we're seeing a lot of business email compromise. On a daily basis, we're seeing this. Social engineering fraud is a massive problem. The threat actors are almost too clever. I'll give you an example from the legal side. As a lawyer, this is what we've seen, but it could apply to any business. There was a young trainee lawyer in the UK, but doesn't really matter, who was Google searching a research problem. And we can all imagine being a young person, you quickly pop onto Google, oh, my client's asked me a question, I must just check it out. And it came up with a link to what looked like a legitimate research engine. So there's certain search engines that are associated with the professions, and this looked like a legitimate search engine. So he clicked on the link and it asked him to enter his firm email credentials, which he did very diligently, thinking he was at a reputable website. And in fact, it wasn't a reputable website. And what that means is somebody out there took the time to create a fraudulent website designed specifically for lawyers, for young lawyers who would be Google searching. Somebody thought about it, somebody implemented it. And the same can be said for any of our businesses, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a medical professional, whether you're a lawyer. Professional services are massively, massively under attack. Business email compromise, anywhere that you deal with money, you hold tax file information, you hold bank account information, you process invoices, you become a target of risk. The level of sophistication that we are seeing in phishing emails is fundamental. And so one of the things we may talk about at the end of the day is, how do we prevent it? Well, it's educate, educate, educate. Your reminders to your own staff, to yourself, not to click on links. What have I clicked on? Should I be entering credentials? If something redirects me somewhere else, if it asks me to open an attachment from a source I don't know, I don't trust, be vigilant about who is sending you emails. Is it actually the person you think it is? Is it not? It's so clever that most businesses are falling victim somewhere in the chain through an employee, through our own actions, to business email compromise attacks. And the problem is most of them involve data breaches, because once you get access to a mailbox, if any of us sit here right now and think about the content of our work email addresses, what is on your mailbox right now? Client information, customer information, staff information, your own personal information. Most of that gets compromised in these attacks. So what are the biggest risks facing your businesses right now? Ransomware and extortion, and I'll talk to ransomware in a minute, which is going to result in encryption of your entire file servers or parts thereof or databases. And imagine not being able to operate your business because your file servers, your customer client databases, or your operating systems have become entirely encrypted. Next big risk is theft of customer, member, or employee data. Again, the reputational risks, the privacy risks, those sorts of things, whether or not it's simply in your jurisdiction or whether you hold information that sits beyond your jurisdiction. Often we've got multi-jurisdictional issues from privacy perspectives. And then DDoS, or distributed denial of services attacks, where industries are actually crippled as a result of these attacks. So I'm going to take 5 minutes to just turn to ransomware, talk you through what that means, look at a ransom note for those who haven't seen one. But what I've shared on the screen right now is an example of a ransom note. They're all quite similar. They all look more or less the same. Some of the known groups, and I keep saying ransomware groups because surprisingly or not, they're actually quite sophisticated networks. It's not always some young 18-year-old sitting in their parents' basement listening to heavy metal music. It's quite often sophisticated networks where they have HR and they have leave days. You'll see, well, we see, for example, August, September are generally quiet months for ransomware attacks because it's summer holidays in Europe and they take leave, the threat actors. So we see these interesting events happening, but groups all use similar language. So some of the ransomware negotiators we work with, they map and track the notes to help track down which group, and is it a splinter group, and where does it fit in, and to extrapolate the data from the ransom attacks that we see. But imagine yourself coming in on a Monday morning, it's been a good weekend, you're logging in, and you can't get access, and suddenly this note pops up onto your screen. What you're going to see is similar things. First thing they're going to tell you is your network's been penetrated, there's ransomware that's been deployed. They're going to talk about encryption. They're going to say, we're able to give you the decryptor or decryption key. They may say things like, don't contact the police. They might say, if you do anything, you'll destroy files. It may say, send me an email or click on this link. But either way, you won't be able to do much, or you won't be sure what's happening on your systems. And the very next question for you is, what do you do next? So in terms of preparing for risk, if you're walking away from this presentation today, an important question for yourself is, what next? What do I do if I'm faced with a scenario? And we must all assume that one day we are faced with a scenario, because I see it happen. I see it happen in your industry, and I see it happen daily. What is your next move? So there's a couple of things you can do. Hopefully nobody goes into the panic button. But there's a couple of things. If you've got insurance, that's fantastic. You may be calling your breach response on your insurance policy. You may end up on my desk where I do incident response. You could be escalating it internally to your IT service provider or your MSP. If you've got an incident response plan, you may be activating that. Or you could just click on the link and pay the ransom. We've seen that happen. We've seen that happen where they've paid ransom and they don't get the decryption key. So there's a couple of things you can do, thinking about what you should and shouldn't do, but it's one of the things you need to say to yourself is, am I ready? Am I prepared? If you're walking away from today, make sure that after this call, you think about convening a crisis management committee. Now, that will depend on the size of your organization. If you're relatively large, you'll have a couple of people. If you're a two-man operation, it may just be you that makes that decision. You might be crisis comms. Then it's about thinking about what your incident response plan looks like. Who do I call? What do I do? Do you have an insurance policy entitlement? What is that entitlement? Have I tested it? Have I stress tested my policy? Looking at the motivations of threat actors, I think we're all pretty sure that 99% of the time, and I'm making up a figure, I don't know if that's a statistic, but the goal is almost always financial. And it's quite interesting when we see the negotiations play out, the threat actors almost position themselves as if they're doing a public service. So they'll tell you how wonderful they are and how they've done this for your benefit. Really what the goal is financial. They're striving to make a benefit. And often when we don't pay the ransom, we see it escalate. Now, remember earlier on, I said 86% of data is exfiltrated. So invariably, if you're hit by a ransomware, some or all of your data may have been or likely has been taken. The other thing that happens is they threaten to leak your data, and that is the double extortion. The first level of extortion is we encrypt your data. Even if you're able to recover from backups, the next level is we will publish your data if you don't pay us the risk or pay us the ransom. What do you do then? So these are some of your options when you're faced with ransomware. There are some strains of ransomware where a public key, a public decryption key is available. Very few and far between, okay? That may be an instance. Be very careful of brokers that say they trade in decryption keys. They're often affiliated with the threat actors. They're not reputable businesses. Some are, some aren't. You can try decryption by brute force. It's generally unsuccessful. The best thing you can do is have your data backed up in an unencrypted environment that you can restore from. That way, you don't ever need to enter into negotiations with your threat actors. You can move on. And then finally, do you pay the ransom? Okay. What does the timeline look like to resolve a ransomware event? Because we all think these things are quick. They're actually not. Sometimes you can restore from backups in a couple of days. That's fairly quickly, but you actually could be offline for weeks on end. And think about that loss to your business. For many businesses, that can represent the difference between life or death, whether you can restore data. So please, please, please think about the cloud. Think about what you're doing from a data storage perspective, making sure your backups aren't linked to your main systems. But really, your first week is really just triaging an event, understanding what has happened in your environment, restoring from backups. Before you've done anything else, you're a week later. Then you're actually responding to the incident. What do I do next? Do I need to communicate with regulators? Is there a privacy breach? Is there clients and customers? Are there service providers that I work with that I've got contracts with that I need to notify about the breach? What do I do next? Then you're looking at the final stage, which is the data investigation. What data was impacted? How do I put in place new systems to mitigate this from happening again? So what we're looking at on average in a ransomware event is anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months to get back to where you were prior to an incident. And I would say in almost all our incidences, 30 days is probably about right before you're fully operational again, if you can restore your data. If you can't restore your data, that may mean you're looking at paying a ransom, and I'll talk to that briefly before I finish up. What are the stages of any investigation? You've got your forensic investigation, what happened? You've got your how do I respond, my communication, reputational risk management, and then you've got your legal risk. So these are the things, the pillars that you're balancing at any phase. So let's look at the payment of a ransom quickly, and I'm just checking the chats in case there's anything that's come in. Nothing at this stage that we can't deal with later on. So this is a transcript from a ransomware negotiation for those that have never seen it before. You'll see that they'll put a price. That price is not the first price, and it's not always quite high. Often it'll be converted into Bitcoin. It's seldomly in AUD. This is just we've converted it, but most often in US dollars. It's got to be paid in a cryptocurrency of sorts. Sometimes we see Bitcoin, sometimes we see other things. But there is a negotiation that happens. But if you start entering into negotiations, we always suggest that you go through a reputable service provider. So if you've got an insurance entitlement, for example, we'll be helping you appoint proper negotiators who can do the negotiations on your behalf. Please don't just pay the ransom. It's very important that you always understand whether or not you're going to get proof of life or the correct decryption key. What we do in any ransom negotiation is we actually do test files with our threat actors. We send them sample files. They send those back decrypted. We make sure that they've got the key to unlock the encryption so that if you do end up paying a ransom, you're not paying a ransom in vain, that it actually gets your files back. But why or when should we pay a ransom? Some considerations for you to think about. And again, it's going to depend on a couple of things. One, the law is applicable in any jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, Singapore, for example, it's not legal to pay ransoms. In other jurisdictions like Australia, it's not illegal to pay a ransom subject to sanctions laws. But remember those things. Can I pay a ransom or not legally? Your ability to pay a ransom, where I'm based, the relevance of the data to your organization. Here are some things to think about generally. Can you back up or not? If all your system is encrypted and you have got nothing from backups, it may need to be that you've got to resort to paying a ransom. Reputational risks. Again, at this stage, we don't recommend paying a ransom to prevent the publication of data. Invariably, your data ends up sold or published whether or not you pay a ransom. The biggest thing for us is, can you operate your business or not without that data? There's some slides for further information purposes. I'm going to skip through some of these just in the interest of time, but this talks through the process of the negotiation, how long it takes in general. Even when we pay a ransom, it could take up to 10 days to get that concluded. Finally, we're going to look at some risk management. So what can you do to get yourself ready from an incident readiness perspective? As I said earlier, reviewing your policies and processes, step one. If you're faced with that risk we spoke about right now, a business email compromise, a phishing scheme, where suddenly your clients receive an email to say your banking details have changed and they make a payment into a fraudulent bank account, you're faced with a ransomware note. What do you do? How do you respond? What is your next step? Make sure you've at the very least asked yourself that question. Planned, prepared, tested it is even better. Educating the key people of your organization is key. Stress test, attending these seminars that the CPA are organizing. Very good to think about. Ask yourself the questions. What about your supply chain exposure? Who do you have to tell what to? Do you have contractual obligations to other parties? Where do you store your data? What about vendors, crisis management teams, key personnel? Who do you turn to in the event of an incident? It's the who you're going to call Ghostbusters joke, but really, who are you going to call? What are you going to do? And then what about your regulatory readiness? What are the laws applicable in any jurisdiction? Or what are they currently? Where are they going to be in the future? What do you know about those? What is your strategy around risk management and what you say to clients? And then most fundamentally, your data. Where is it stored? Who has access to it? Why is it stored in that method? Is there something better you can do to better protect your data? Because at the end of the day, the financial motive is around the data. These are just some more tips for when you get there. And on that basis, I'm going to quickly turn to the questions that have come into the chat just to see if there's anything that we should deal with at this stage, or could you prefer that we deal with those at the end?
Maybe at the end in the moderated bit.
Great.
Nicole,
then we'll carry on.
Some of the questions are absolutely great, and I think very relevant to both presentations. So we might.
Great. Then on that note, I'm going to hand over back to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole, for that comprehensive and insightful presentation. And I particularly appreciate your sharing on what businesses should do as part of the risk management. And I think this is very important. This is something that I believe our participants today can bring back to their respective organization as well to ask these different questions, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for those of you who have submitted your questions via the chat function. Feel free to submit more questions. We will try to address those questions during the panel discussion session after our second presentation. Now, on that note, I would like to welcome our second presenter, Ms. Maria Theo. So Maria is an Associate Director of Risk Advisory at CLATS Singapore, previously Nexia TS. Maria has more than 10 years of experience in assurance, compliance, and other advisory work. She now specialized in sustainability and risk advisory and data governance implementation and compliance. She has also specialized in training development and administration and has developed and conducted training including on topics such as data protection and cybersecurity. Welcome, Maria. I'm pleased to pass the session to you for the next 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Oki, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come here and share a little bit about the work we do with regards to cybersecurity. And we work a lot with accountants as well as people in the finance function, because when cybersecurity hits, usually the finance people are on the hot dial list where, you know, bosses want to know what's going to happen, how much it's going to cost, and what is really the impact to the bottom line of business. So My sharing today will be circling around how cybersecurity concerns, risk assessments, and ultimately, if a threat happens, what this impact on finance is going to look like, as well as how we can all safeguard our assets. So it's just a little introduction about my firm and what we do. So we have just undergone a rebranding exercise. Formerly, we were known as Nexia TS, and now we've been rebranded to CLA Global TS. And I sit under the risk advisory team at CLA Global TS. And what my team does is that we handle things such as cybersecurity, incident response. I also sit on the forensic and litigation support team. So if there's something that requires incident response, digital forensics or forensic accounting, that's where my team gets activated. And of late, we're also moving into the sustainability and climate change advisory work, where cybersecurity and privacy is deeply intertwined. So personally, I also deal a lot with data privacy and data governance, and I have some certifications with privacy protection as well. So the things I'm going to share today circle around these few topics. First of all, I'd like to share a little bit about how technology has evolved around the years and how that also changes the way we are going to assess the risk with regard to cybersecurity. Secondly, when we talk about risk, how do we quantify this? How are we going to assess it? And are your organizations really at risk? Then we move on to how are you going to protect your assets or define the assets that you'd like to protect? And lastly, we go through some of the cybersecurity trends. So we've already touched on some of the global side as well as the Australasian side. So I'd like to come a little bit more also to what Asia as well as Singapore have been facing and to share some of the cases that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. So just to start the conversation, some of the highlights of cybersecurity that we're seeing over the last 2 years is that this is an international concern. Similar to the statistics presented by the previous panelists, we're seeing cyber incidents rise across the globe. And the most worrying thing, if you look here, is that a good 30% of companies are still not managing cyber risk actively or properly, and they're only reacting to it after it happens. So this is very worrying for us. In defending companies, it's very positive on the threat actor side, and a good 10% of them are not managing cyber risk at all. So at this point in time, I'd also like to trigger this thought within the participants' mind of how reliant are we on technology. So this also harks back to the message that if this data were to be exposed or were to be exfiltrated, how likely are you going to be able to continue your business with this data breach at hand? So the trend we're seeing nowadays when we speak to our clients as well as to Singapore companies at large is that we are moving towards the extremely reliant space, where especially with COVID and working from home and remote working, we are seeing people move more and more towards cloud technology, the Internet of Things, as well as looking at how people can bring their work everywhere with them. And in the quest to look for more convenience and more portability, there is some trade-off in terms of the cybersecurity controls that we're going to have in place. All right, so with that, we move on to this timeline of how technology has been evolving in the last almost 100 years now. So we start in the 1930s because that's when the first computer was invented. Subsequently, we had internet since the 1980s, and then we see the first computer and virus coming up very swiftly after that, just 8 years after the internet had been launched. Since then, there's an explosion of our tech companies. We see applications coming up, people moving to the cloud, infrastructure is ballooning. And what we have then is that the DDoS attacks or denial of service has started as of early 2000s. From there, we have business email compromises, and they developed so fast and so quickly, and data breaches became something that the whole world has been focusing their attention on since the late 2010s. With this in mind, when do you think the first hacking incident took place? So when we ask this question at other webinars or with different audiences, they always tell me, oh, it should be sometime after Yahoo or Google were formed, or maybe after Facebook became a thing. But in actual fact, the first hacking incident took place in 1971. So there's always a shock factor because this even precedes the beginning of the internet. So what this shows is that hacking is as old as our internet, as old as the technologies that we are used to knowing, and it has developed alongside these developments that we are seeing as well. All right, so from a finance point of view, we're very concerned about this as well, because in terms of the dollar value that we're looking at, it has been rising astronomically over the last 5 years. So up to 2021, you can see that complaints have been rising almost to 1 million documented complaints, as well as the losses are amounting to over almost $7 billion in 2021. So that's a lot of money. And this is only the known facts, where people who have registered their losses or their breaches are collated together and they form these numbers that we're looking at now. I think we can all be very comfortable to say that this is not the full picture, and there are definitely more people who are not disclosing the fact that they have had a data breach or the losses that they are facing as a result of that data breach. So this number can only be bigger than what we see here. All right, so with that, I'd like to share with you a couple of case studies that we have gone through in terms of incident response. So the first one is on the very common topic of ransomware and how this has hit one of our clients. So this was a group of companies who was headquartered in Singapore and had operations around the Southeast Asian region. They were in the manufacturing space. And what happened was that they were first hit by ransomware in the overseas subsidiary. So the overseas subsidiary didn't have very sophisticated data controls or infrastructure, and therefore they had no choice, they felt, but to pay the ransom in order to unlock the data. So they paid about 100,000 Singapore dollars in order to unlock the data. Subsequently, they thought they would manage to decrypt the data. There was no further investigation done. Nothing was done to remediate the situation or to investigate if there was a root cause to this intrusion. Subsequently, in 2019, another overseas subsidiary in a different country also fell prey to ransomware. So this time they were held ransom for $300,000. And again, they paid the money because they had no other choice. Their data was being held hostage and they could not proceed or carry on operations as usual without unlocking this data. So in 2 years, they've been hit twice and they've paid up over $400,000. Again, to make matters worse, nothing else was done again after the second incident. So to compound matters, in 2020, the Singapore headquarters was struck by an attack. So this was the third time in 3 years that they were targeted for ransomware. And this time they were asking for $500,000. So when headquarters was made aware of this amount, they said, this must be, there's a conspiracy theory here. We've been targeted 3 times in 3 years. What is going on? So they finally looked for investigators in order to see whether there was some common running through these 3 incidents, or whether it was, as they suspected, an insider attack. So at this point, that's where my team was engaged to assist with incident response as well as investigation into what happened and what were the root causes of these 3 incidents, whether or not they were isolated or whether they were linked together. So the takeaway from this scenario is that the hackers are actually learning from our patterns and our behavior. So by paying the ransom and leaving the back door open and not shutting off the weaknesses that you previously had, this displays that this company was a soft target, as it's known. They are willing to pay the ransom and they don't really do anything after that to prevent future hacks from happening. So this paints a target on their back, and that's why the second and third incident happened. So as the result of the investigation, where it was shown that actually the threats were coming from overseas and not from an internal network, this made management very displeased because they preferred to think that it was an internal sabotage rather than them being targeted on a higher level. Okay, so the second one is something that we're seeing increasingly in Singapore and Southeast Asia as well, which is what we call the man-in-the-middle attack. So this builds on the trend that we're seeing a lot of impersonation cases. We're seeing email mailbox takeovers. And what this is showing is that these hackers are in for the long game, where they are willing to sit in your mailbox and harvest data about you for a period of time that could be spanning 1 to 2 years, to understand your behavior and to understand how you write your emails. And then when the time is right, they will shut down your email box and start to impersonate you. So what happened in this case, which we assisted with, was that this client of ours was in the medical equipment trading industry. So they placed an order to purchase medical equipment. So in this case, it was something like dentist chairs, so something large, and it was pretty expensive. So the supplier had delivered the equipment, everything was signed, the paperwork was in order, and then the supplier sent the invoice for payment. So as was their procurement process, they processed it and it went into their finance system as part of the payables. Subsequently, and you see here in this box in red, this is where things start to go wrong. So the company received an email that the bank account of this supplier had changed. So instead of maybe a Maybank account, it was now JP Morgan account. So with this change, the company thought nothing of it. They updated their finance system and then they made payment to this new account because on surface, it looked like it come from a legitimate internal email from their supplier. So once this payment had been made, the finance people closed off the payables and they thought nothing about it. But subsequently, after 1 or 2 months, the suppliers started chasing for payment because on their side, they were still reflecting a payable. So at this point, both the company and the supplier realized that something was going wrong. And then they realized that they had made a wrong payment and the change of bank account was actually not legitimate. So this started a two-pronged investigation on both the supplier as well as the company, at which point they were unable to come to a conclusion on which party had been hacked. Was it the supplier's email that had been hacked, sending an impersonated email to the company? Or was it the company's email domain that had been hacked and a false email had been sent in? So because there was no conclusion on which party was at fault, in the end, they split the cost 50-50, and the total losses amount to over $100,000, including the original invoice that had been misled into the JP Morgan account. So in this case, it becomes very critical for us to evaluate the legitimacy of the person sending us emails. Sometimes it could be email compromise on the other party side. Sometimes it could be emails that are just very slightly different from the original email, and they are customized to try to trick you into responding to them. So some parties that are especially vulnerable are our finance and HR functions because they receive a lot of emails with attachments. For example, we often see HRs receiving a CV from a candidate that you would like to recruit. And all the HRs that we approach would think nothing about clicking open a Word document that claims to be a CV of a candidate. Likewise, when finance receives an invoice that they're supposed to pay, they wouldn't think twice about clicking on this and processing it into the system. So this makes these two functions very vulnerable to attacks, and hackers can launch a very standardized attack mode against both the HR and the finance, and hope they can get pretty good returns this way. So that's why the man-in-the-middle attack is becoming very dangerous, because it impersonates people you're familiar with. They modulate the patterns and the behavior that your suppliers and your customers are using, and they use this to try to attract payments out of legitimate accounts into their own bank accounts. Okay, so with that in mind and being a little bit more aware of how we could be vulnerable to cyber attacks, now I'd like to draw the conversation to cyber risk. Okay, so as you can see here, it's no longer a question of if, but when. So most companies can expect that you'll be targeted sometime over your lifetime or increasingly over the next few years. So are you ready, or have you been sufficiently prepared in the event of an attack? So some of the threats that you may hear, or maybe your IT persons will be talking to you about, besides things like third-party damages and business interruption, we are also very concerned about your intellectual property. In addition to your customer databases and your sales databases, you may have intellectual property that you want to keep hold of. So these threat actors could be targeting your crown jewels in the form of your intellectual property. So next, we are also very concerned now about data breaches, because increasingly over the world, you are going to have some notification obligations in terms of data breaches. So in Singapore, if over 500 people's information is breached, you have a liability to make a report to the Singapore PDPC. And likewise, under GDPR, if you're handling European individuals' data, there are responsibilities and obligations that the company needs to undertake in the event of a breach. So this makes it more and more expensive if a breach were to happen, because not only do you have to remediate and look at what's happening in your company, you now also have to consider whether or not you have compliance requirements to other bodies as well. So the last one, which everyone would like to avoid very much, is the problem of cyber extortion. So as mentioned earlier, you could be extorted once for your ransomware, and then another time when they threaten to expose your data. Even if they promise to delete it, they can always come back again and claim that they didn't delete it, or there was another copy, and then extort you again. So the threat will linger over your head forever once your data is out there on the dark web. So what can we do about this, and where are you going to assess, where do you start assessing your risk from? So in this case, we have a diagram here where you can think of your company surrounded by a brick wall, where your brick wall is made up of your cyber defenses and controls. Okay, we first of all have to look at whether or not there's a risk of internal threats. So for example, do you have disgruntled employees? Do you have people who are not happy with the way you're conducting business, or people who are out to cause trouble, who will then start a case of sabotage or leaking a virus in-house? Okay, so we first of all have to look at the risk of internal threats. Secondly, we also have to consider what's the risk of being threatened by external actors. So besides hacking, we also have people who are spying on your company. So they could be competitors or other people who are interested to learn about your business model. They could be politically motivated as well. They could be monitoring your business activities through remote access Trojans, where they just sit on your computer and monitor what you're doing, or have installed a keylogger on your computer to monitor what keys you're tapping. And that's frequently how they get to know your passwords. Or the tried and true method of launching phishing emails and going through the business email compromise route. So these are external threats we need to learn how to manage as well. So depending on how vulnerable you are, how exposed you are to cyber attacks, you may want to employ more cybersecurity controls so that your wall is thicker, and at least protecting against external threats, you feel a little bit more comfortable about that. So the question at the end of the day, or the question your auditors or your insurers are going to ask you is, how thick is your wall against cyber attacks? What have you done to make sure that you have at least minimized the risk of being targeted? Okay. To that, we then need to also see what are the areas that we want to focus on. So we always recommend going on a risk-based approach and putting more emphasis on the things that are critical to your business, or if these things were compromised, they would severely affect business as usual. So we're looking at not only customer information and personal data, we also look at your intellectual properties. If you do R&D or engineering, you may also have valuable data that shouldn't be leaked out. Strategies, financial information, or financial data, also things you would like to safeguard as well as any projects that you have that are under that are classified or confidential. So the first step that all of us might want to undertake would be to look at our inventory of data and whether we know where I should be spending the most time or protection on. So lastly, the most important thing that we all want to safeguard are our people. So our people are both our most important and our weakest link. So in order to protect them, we need to make sure that they know what they're doing, that they're aware of the threat and what could go wrong. So one of the recent cases that we did, we actually had to brief the incident manager of what a phishing attack was, because they weren't aware of what phishing was and how this person could have penetrated their infrastructure. So are your people aware of the common ways that they could be compromised? Do they know what they should look out for? Do they know what a phishing email is going to look like? So these are some questions that we can answer now in peacetime before a breach happens. Okay. So with that in mind, here are some areas where you can look at to protect your digital assets. So besides assessing the risk, as we have spoken about earlier, as well as applying suitable measures on top of them, these two factors will merge together to form your cybersecurity risk management program. Okay, so how do you then go about this program? So first of all, we need to know what we're protecting. So by defining the areas which we want to focus more on, your crown jewels, your databases, and also the risks that each of them face, that's how you start to then assess whether or not you're going to be very vulnerable to a risk, to an attack. And if an attack were to happen, do you have any redundancies or do you have any backup plans if this were to occur? Okay, so once this happens, what is your risk tolerance? Are you able to accept the risk? Do you want to avoid it, or do you want to transfer it on to a third party, as was mentioned, by going to cyber insurers? So the last one is then, who's in charge of this program? Who do you go to if something goes wrong? And are they aware of their role in the organization, of the responsibilities that is placed on their shoulders, and what could go wrong if they don't execute their role properly? So with this, you know the risk areas that you have to pay a little bit more attention to. You have a better understanding of whether or not you can accept this risk or you want to minimize it by employing some risk management strategies. And lastly, you appoint people in charge to manage this risk, provide some oversight, and to continually look at whether this risk landscape is going to change. So these are also some of the terms that you will hear when you talk to cybersecurity providers and when they try to maybe showcase some of their solutions or the services that they can provide. So some of the most common cybersecurity techniques that you hear are vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, or we call them VAPT. So VAPT is a detective tool, also preventive, to make sure that if there are any weaknesses in your infrastructure, they are out there scanning for it, as well as to do ethical hacking on your environment, so that if there are any significant weaknesses, they will then suggest to your IT, okay, let's patch this up and protect yourself a little bit better. After something were to happen, that's where forensic technology comes in, where you get information from devices that was compromised. And also, these are also some of the terms that will be useful, where if you feel that phishing emails are a huge risk to your company, conducting a simulation exercise or by launching a phishing email campaign, that's something you can do also to educate your employees on what a phishing email is going to look like and whether or not they're going to be very vulnerable to it. It's also very important to do constant monitoring and oversight. So whether it's in-house or outsourced, this is something that will be very key to your cybersecurity program, as well as the last point on reviewing your infrastructure. And this has to be done periodically, not just once, but preferably at least annually, if not more frequently than that, to ensure that you're aware of new risks that are coming up on the landscape. Okay. So I think I've run very close to the end of the time, so just give me 1 minute to also share a little bit about some of the other trends that you might look out for or that will change the risk that you're facing. So as I mentioned earlier, we're all moving towards cloud solutions and offsite technology. So with the digitalization and decentralization of data, this opens us up to different risks, not more or less, but different risks. So are we ready to accept this risk or to somehow mitigate them or to integrate them into our risk management programs, as well as do we know the risk that these new solutions are posing to us? So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation and I'll hand it back to Oki.
Yes, thank you, Maria, for your comprehensive sharing. I find the case studies particularly interesting and eye-opening, actually providing context on how common these threats really are. And I'm sure many of our participants today appreciate your presentation, highlighting how we can assess these cyber risks, and more importantly, the kind of questions that we need to ask to identify the right measures. So thank you for that, Maria. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, following the sharing from our two speakers, I would like to now pass the session to Ms. Kristen Biddle, who will be moderating a panel discussion with Nicole and Maria. So Kristen is the Manager of Public Practice and SME at CPA Australia. Her role encompasses technical tools and resources for members, as well as policy areas such as insolvency and consumer data right. Welcome, Kristen. I'm sure you've been monitoring our chat function. There have been some questions raised by some of our participants. Some discussion and exchange as well amongst our participants. So thank you, participants, for your sharing as well. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to moderate this session. So one of the things that really has come out to me, but also a lot of the audience today, both Nicole and Maria, I'll say, is, you know, how do the participants best educate their staff about what they need to do with cybersecurity?
Maria, do you want to take that one first?
Yes, so one of the low-hanging fruits, I would say, is to assess whether or not your employees are even aware of cyber risk in terms of how they could be weaponized or targeted. So, for example, if your receptionist is not aware that she could be targeted by, threat actors coming through the public phone system, then they're not going to be looking out for this kind of risk. So, first of all, I know we keep emphasizing the education and awareness. It is a very important place to start and to keep reiterating the message, because it's not once and done. It has to be done almost annually, or when you have new people in the organization, it will have to be repeated over and over again. So I think something that people also find effective is to have maybe e-training on this, so that you get the standardized message out to all your staff. You can rerun this campaign ever so often, and by this way you get everybody on board with the cybersecurity program.
Yeah, maybe just to add one thing to that is getting the message to your staff that if something's happened, please let us know. Sometimes you can't prevent it, but if you know about it, instead of them hiding it, it's also about knowing how to fix it, because staff hide things from us too.
Yep. Hopefully not. And I think, sometimes when employees leave a company as well, people, might forget to turn off their access to the systems and those kind of things. And if you're worried about that, that might be a way in which penetrations can happen as well. So just make sure that, if a policy is there to say, if an employee does leave to turn off their access to any of your systems, that is in fact done immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very important. And maybe just to add on a little bit to that, we've seen cases where disgruntled employees were leaving the company and they've either deleted huge amounts of data or they've taken it with them. So these are both scenarios which you don't want to happen. And that's why the offboarding process is going to be very important to prevent data breaches as well.
And another thing that's coming out is people are saying, well, if there's been a breach, how do I know it was from my employee side or somebody externally? How do they figure that out?
I think that's going to be a very challenging question to answer as well, because we've seen cases of both internal saboteurs masquerading as external ones through VPNs or trying to look as if their IP address comes from overseas, as well as external people trying to mimic the IP addresses of internal people. So we're really looking at patterns, trends, dates of access, even language patterns and things like that, which will indicate a little bit more about identities and locations of people. But at the end of the day, it can be very difficult, also due to the lack of data available, because usually people don't do backups, people don't keep logs, they're not monitoring what's going on. So at the end of the day, the investigation is only as good as the data you're able to provide. So there are limitations in terms of what can be found out.
And perhaps on that as well, it's also about utilizing the tools that you've got for free that you may not even know about within your environment. So for example, if you've got Defender on your MS environment, there's some simple things you can do to extend your logs for 30 days as opposed to 9 days. There's some things you can do that allow investigators to have forensic artifacts that can help you investigate the source of that incident after the fact as well.
Yeah.
And so would you recommend the participants today, in addition to looking internally at their education of themselves and their employees, do you think that they should be putting in more layers of authentication or software to prevent these attacks, or to sort of slow the system down to go, well, is this really you making this payment, and those kind of processes?
Well, I'd say that's a double-edged sword, because convenience and security are going to be at loggerheads with each other. So we often recommend having more safeguards and security controls in place but these come with drawbacks in terms of not being able to access the data as conveniently as you like. For example, even something as simple as two-factor authentication. Some people are not willing to turn on the phone and have that second password pop up and then key into the system. So when you get resistance like that, we do try to recommend it, but you know, practically there are some restrictions in place as well.
Is that not just, you know, part and parcel of doing business now? I mean, wouldn't that be best practice? I understand it's inconvenient that you're doing something and then you've got to go over to your phone and get your code and then put it back in. But, you know, isn't that just part and parcel of you know, good cyber governance?
Yes, we all think so. So the thing is that while we all know that cyber governance or good data hygiene is important, the ways we can go about it or the methods of implementation are, you know, they are limitless. So we could choose to maybe do it in less intrusive ways, or some people choose to close down everything altogether. I saw one of the comments where having segregated networks is something that Singapore has employed as well. Of course, it's very effective, but operationally it then creates you know, some dissatisfaction because people can't access the internet on their main laptop, and then they have to find workarounds and things like that. So you know, while we all maybe have this idea that it's important to be cyber safe, when it comes to actually spending money or to institutionalize this in our organization, that may be a different story.
Nicole, did you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think we've covered pretty much all the pertinent points. I think it's all just about hygiene within an organization, hygiene within an organization, hygiene within an organization, and about driving that message of consistency. And again, these things, it's about knowing that this can and will potentially happen to your organization. It's not about being naive, and education is key, and making sure you've got systems in place to help you identify what's happening and prevent it is best. But even the best security can sometimes only keep the good guys out, you know. So it's also about doing what you can reactively as well.
Yeah, I understand. And we did have one good question, and I've often wondered this myself actually. So I'm glad it was asked as well, and it was you know, sort of based on your experiences. Is there a type of company that cyber criminals might go after? I mean, do they go on region? Do they go on size? You know, amount of employees, those kind of things, or you know, even something as, you know, we know that they run a particular operating system and that's an easy one to penetrate. Like what trends do you see in terms of similarities?
So on our end, I think it's pretty much anyone is fair game. Anywhere in particular, if we had a look at sort of top 5, those stats are available sort of at any point, but anything that deals with finances in any way. So it's professional services, medical companies are massively a target. It varies in industry size. So like I said in my presentation, sometimes we see trends amongst SME businesses, and then that may shift for a month or two to larger organizations, and then it shifts back. Any company is subject to being subject to ransomware. Maria, I don't know if you see something different, but I think it's fair game.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, Nicole. So I think what we were seeing over the last few years was that attacks used to be very much like a sledgehammer. They would employ the same brute force tactics on everybody, and it was really obvious. Everyone knew it was bad English, you know, it looked suspicious, and then you would avoid it. But they've evolved as well, and they've really corporatized themselves into, you know, they have strategies, they have sales teams, they have you know, they learn how to target certain industries and what are the weaknesses in these industries. So for example, if you're a recruitment firm, you're going to get a lot of inquiries from random people with no background, and you just click on these documents and open it. So they would customize the target strategy to industries or the companies. And I think they then learn, okay, you know, this works, this doesn't work. They refine it a little bit further, and then we have different strategies for all the you know, big companies, small companies, medical, tech. So in a sense, no one should be lulled into either a false sense of security or being paranoid, but we just want to be aware that anyone out there could be targeted.
And I guess, you know, we're talking to a lot of people with, you know, different resource levels here. So, you know, is it worth them going through this process of implementing their cyber plan, basically, or putting together what they need to, or is it just easy to go and get insurance and then pay the money when they are attacked?
I think it's going to be difficult to get the insurance if you don't put the plan in events. So cyber insurance is a finicky market. 10 years ago, it was open market and nobody wanted it. Now everybody wants it, nobody can get it. So it's everything you do changes your risk profile for an insurer who underwrites it. And so it's better to focus on prevention than cure. It always is. But having a remedy and a cure available resources to throw in the event of an incident is equally useful.
Yeah. I think I also want to draw parallels to, let's say, you know, our own health. So you go to the doctor, you buy health insurance, you also do checkups and you take medicine and all these kind of things. So it's not as if we are looking for a magic pill to solve this cybersecurity problem. It's probably going to be a combination of factors where, first of all, you got to be aware of what you have, you got to do some reviews, you got to do audits, you got to have detective systems, and then on top of that, as a last, you know, the last mile, then insurance can come in to help to mitigate the last bit of risk, because it's impossible to mitigate 100% of risks just internally. So you're going to have one, you know, that the fire extinguisher out there, which is your cyber insurer.
I like that analogy. That was that was a very good one. Thank you. What are the regulators saying to accountants in your respective jurisdictions about what they need to look out for, if you're aware of that?
So one thing I'm seeing very clearly for breaches being reported to the regulator in Australia, the Office of the Information Commissioner in Australia is coming back and talking about data retention. So I'm sure it's a hot topic everywhere, but when you no longer need clients' information, let it go. And I think that's the hardest thing, to quote Frozen, let it go, let it go. But really don't hold on to things you don't need. And I know that has a time cost balance, but the risk to keeping things when someone is no longer your client, and I know every accountant's shouting at me right now, but what if they come back to me in 10 years and they want it then? Well, then tough, or at least write to those clients and say, we're going to purge your data X, Y, and Z, but don't hang on to things years and years after you don't need them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maria, did you have something else?
Yes, I think to add on to what Nicole was also saying, from an accountant's point of view, what we're seeing is that twofold. The first thing is that if you have an ongoing breach, your auditors may come and ask you if you've provided for your commitments and your liabilities going forward. So this not only has a current year impact, you may see it going over 2 or 3 years, especially if you're facing litigation or class action lawsuits. This financial impact is going to span over some time. The second thing is because there's a disclosure requirement. If you're a listed company, you might need to make filings, you might need to inform the authorities and things like that. And they're frequently going to ask you to quantify information. So how much data was leaked? How much is it going to cost you? And then again, are you appointing third parties to come in and help? So I think we also shouldn't be underestimating the cost to remediate after a breach, where if you want to prevent this from happening again, you might need to spend certain sums in hiring cybersecurity experts to reinforce your defenses and things like that. So all of these will have financial impact. And we're seeing auditors ask, are there any amounts you have not accounted for, which we'll see in the next year? So you might have to provide a fairly substantial amount.
Yeah. And we had a quick question in, just following up on the conversation that we had before on insurances. So is there any insurance cover the damage or loss caused by a cyber attack? So I think a lot of my understanding is that they're, depending on where you are, there is cover available. But as you were pointing out, Nicole, there's a lot of hoops you need to go through to make sure that it gets paid
and
out.
again, it's about understanding what the end result is. So we always look at it as what we call first party and third party loss. First party loss, the losses you sustain, so the costs of restoring the forensic investigation, certain things you need to do from lawyers to whatever you need after the event. And then third-party losses are the compensation payable out to third parties, claimants, regulators. Not all those fines that are perhaps issued are insurable depending on the jurisdiction, but generally speaking, there's insurance to pick up all those types of costs. It depends on what your business needs for any point in time.
Yeah, I think adding on to what Nicole was saying, while insurance can cover some of it, there is frequently a co-pay element, which means that the company is still going to be liable for a certain amount of the money incurred, up to maybe 30,000, 50,000, and so on and so forth, which is still a bullet that the company is going to have to fight. Some money is going to have to go out before insurance is going to kick in. So if your investigation costs $100,000, you might still have to pay part of it before insurance covers the rest.
And practically, I mean, where do people start in their, say for example, we're all at zero, and what's the first thing that people should be doing to get their cyber plan ready to go?
I think a good step that anyone can take if they don't know what they don't know is to first assess, what's the situation like, to do a risk assessment and to really inventory the type of data that they're holding on to. You don't want to spend too much money just kind of trying to protect everything. You want to focus a little bit more on what's going to cause real damage if it's breached, or, having maybe one solution to mitigate the most risk. So in order to do that, you first need to know what your highest risk actors are, and then plan your strategy accordingly to that. I think that's something that a lot of accountants intuitively understand, especially when we're looking at numbers or marketing resources and things like that. So this is a concept that most of us will understand.
I think it's also really just about testing. So if you're faced with one of the scenarios we spoke about today, and I know we always say if, and it's a big if, it's not an if, let's assume it's a when. And if you're staring that down, what do you do? It's simple things like, if I can't communicate over email to my staff because my emails have gone down, what is my next channel of communication? Who communicates what? Who do I contact if something is wrong? Who is that next chain that I get hold of? It's having asked those questions at a management level can make a fundamental difference to how quickly you can resolve an incident and how quickly you can contain and mitigate it.
What I was thinking about when you were talking then, Nicole, is fax machines might make a comeback for something that we haven't used in 15 years or so.
It becomes very popular, or those sorts of chats. Suddenly there's a chat group, and you also don't want to be communicating it broadly. It's things like, you don't want to tell everyone the day an incident happens and an incident has happened. You don't know what that means. It could be a nothing. So you don't want to send an email out to your entire client database and say, oh, we've had an incident, or your entire employee base. You've got to know what that channel is and how you communicate it, because control the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. I liked what you said before about getting together like an incident response team, or your firm champions, as it were, to go through and say, right, this is, we're in charge of putting together our plan or our response or whatever. But even, looking at internal policies, for example, about, we were talking about offboarding before, but, payments of clients. I mean, you might need to look at those payment procedures that you have in Maria, your one of your examples before. It's something as easy as, well, geez, there's been a change to a bank account. I'm just about to pay a large amount of money. Maybe I should phone up just to check that this bank account number is in fact correct. And just even those little things. And it's a little bit more labour intensive, and it's a little bit more, hands-on and another process. But that might be something that you need to put into your process documents to make sure that in fact happens every time. And not only that, but then go back to your employees and train them on those process and those policy changes to say this must happen every time. So, you know, just small little things like that might be good. So we're going to run out of time because I know we'll have a bit of a closing address. But I guess what's the one thing? So after everyone finishes, they stand up, they have a stretch, make themselves a cup of tea. What is the one thing that you would say to them to do after today's presentation?
I think if there's one takeaway that I'd like all our participants to really internalize, is to be vigilant, or to be aware that anyone can be targeted. And once you are more vigilant, you start to look out for things that could potentially go wrong and providing a little bit more oversight. So that's always a key place to start.
Yeah, and if anything, I would just say it's not always about spending money on a problem. It's about looking what resources are freely available to you. So read, research, look what your offerings are internally from an IT perspective, see where you can patch and stress test just from free mechanisms. Don't necessarily go out and spend lots of money, but just see what resources you actually have available already on hand.
Thank you very much. Well, there's 5 minutes to go, so I'll hand that back to you, Oki. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Kristen, Nicole, and Maria for that excellent discussion. Plenty of important takeaways that all of us can bring back to our organization and ask the very important question of are we protected? Actually, I would like to highlight, I guess, some of the final comments that Maria and Nicole has to say to wrap up all of this discussion. So be vigilant. All of us can be targeted. All of us are pretty much exposed in today's open borderless virtual environment. So at the end of the day, each and every one of us need to be responsible with what we do. And Nicole also mentioned about looking at the resources available to us, resources available around us. So to use those resources and then try to take our very first step, if we haven't already, to try to protect ourselves, our business from this cybersecurity attacks. So I'm sure our participants can bring all of these important takeaways back and have this very important discussion with their teams and with their organizations. Thank you, participants, not only for your questions, but also for the active exchange and sharing that all of you are also doing, especially through our chat function. So thank you for that. So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our webinar today. I certainly hope that you find the sharing and discussion informative and useful. But before we end, I would like to highlight some final information for our participants. I'm pleased to extend an invitation for everyone to participate in our final webinar for 2022. So AFA, together with the IFRS for NPO and Villager, will be organizing a 60 minutes complimentary webinar on the future of nonprofit financial reporting ASEAN perspective on December 8, 2022. An interesting topic, I believe, for many of us with interest in nonprofit organizations or NPOs and their financial reporting, especially from the perspective of the absence of international reporting framework for the sector. So please follow our social media for further information about this particular webinar. And participants, your feedbacks would also be very much appreciated. So please kindly refer to the QR code and the link on your screen to access our post-event survey. And upon a completion of the survey, we will provide you with your e-certificate of participation and a copy of the presentation slides. So please use these slides for your further discussion with your team, with your organizations, and then do what you need to do to assess your organization's readiness in terms of dealing with the cybersecurity attacks. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the organizers, AFA and CPA Australia, I would like to thank once again our speakers, Ms. Nicole Gabrick and Ms. Maria Theo, our moderator, Ms. Kristen Biddle, and thanks again for all of our participants for your active participation in today's webinar. My name is Auki Pratama. See you at our next event. Thank you.